Welcome back to the discussion of Chapter 4. In this chapter, we meet Zossimov, who has been there several times to check in on Raskolnikov at Razumihin's request. And he is there again, and Razumihin is very excited to tell him that Raskolnikov has woken up and that he's looking better, although Raskolnikov isn't talkative. He's just laying in bed, staring at the wall. And Razumihin starts talking about how he is going to a party that night. He wants Zossimov to come, and he mentions that Zametov is going to be there. And he's like, "What do you have to do with the Zametov guy? Like, why would you be hanging around with police clerks?" And is kind of judging him for like he's judging him for being friends with Zametov, and he's like, he takes bribes. And Razumihin's like, well, what do I care if he takes bribes? He's a young boy, and basically, like, I'm trying to be a friend to him and mentor him, and lectures aren't going to do anything. We just got to kind of like draw him in, like be the light. And so he's like, we're not going to stop being friends with him. He's coming, and he talks about that his uncle is also in St. Petersburg and will be at this party. And he's like, I see him, once every 5 years, but I like the guy. He's 65 and he is an investigator with the police department. And he starts talking about the painters from the scene of the murder, this Nikolay and Dmitri. These were the painters that were in the open flat that were painting at the time that Raskolnikov went up and murdered the pawnbroker and Lizaveta. And remember when Raskolnikov was on the stairs and when he was listening to like go out and trying to see if it was safe, he heard all this kind of like crazy ruckus, and somebody was calling after somebody else. And there was just like a big ruckus down the stairs. And he was like, oh, okay, now is a good time. And that's when he sneaked down the stairs. He tucked into that. Then he hears Coke and the other guy coming up the stairs, and he's like, oh, they're coming back up with the porter. I've got to hide. And he remembers and sees the open flat. He goes into the open flat, gets behind the door, and just kind of like stays behind the door until they pass by, and then he goes down the stairs unobserved. Well, Razumihin tells this interesting story where this painter, Nikolay, has been held and kind of accused of the murder, and is almost like isn't saying like he didn't do it. Like he what happened was he went after the ruckus with him and his friend. He says it that that the two painters, Nikolai and Dmitri, were cleaning up for the day. They were done. They were done painting. And that Dmitri went up to Nikolai and like brushed his face with paint. And so then they started like, boyishly wrestling, chasing after each other. And that was what all of the commotion was. Chasing each other down the stairs, out into the street, like kind of play fighting, rolling around on the ground, grabbing each other's hair. And this just kind of wrestling around and making a big scene. So everybody sees this scene going on. And finally, Nikolai goes back upstairs to finish wrapping up, and he sees a box on the floor behind the door. And he picks it up, and it's a pair of earrings. And he brought these earrings to a pawnbroker. He didn't know about the murder at this point. He brings these earrings to a pawnbroker, gets, a little bit of money for him, and then goes on a drinking binge. And so he's off drinking, and then he finds out about the murder. And then he's nervous that he's going to be suspected because he, had these earrings, pawned these earrings. He keeps telling the people who are questioning him, like, oh, I found him in the street. I found him in the street. Then he gets questioned by the police, and he finally breaks down and is like, okay, I found them in the flat where I was painting. He tells them the whole story. And Razumihin just thinks it's ridiculous that anybody thinks that Nikolai was the murderer. He's like, why right after murdering? He's like, the bodies were still warm. They were just being discovered by the porter. And why would these guys go and like be wrestling in the street and giggling? Like that's their alibi. It's like people don't behave that way, and like making sure that everybody sees them. It's like that puts them almost at the scene of the crime. Like that nobody would behave that way. People would be, and he says, like quietly trying to get away unobserved. They wouldn't be making this huge scene and like showing themselves at the scene of the crime. And he's like, he just thinks that like clearly that exonerates Nikolai is his behavior, and that there's, he says 10, like 10 witnesses that saw him. There was all these people that were like there at the time that were witnesses to this event. And so clearly that exonerates him. And he thinks that it's just so stupid that the police even think that, he's the murderer, and that they think that because after he had been discovered with these earrings that were then conclusively proven to be from the pawnbroker stash, because they traced it back to the original owner, that he was caught trying to attempt to hang himself. And they're like, well, why would you have tried to hang yourself? And he's like, well, because I was anxious. And they're like, anxious over what? And he's like, that people would think that I murdered the pawnbroker. And so they're thinking, well, you're hanging yourself because you're guilty and you're just trying to get out of it. And he's like, no, I just was nervous that they were going to think that I was guilty. And so it's just kind of this series of events. But Razumihin's just like, this is my goal, is to get him off and to prove that, he's like, clearly, and he states it exactly as it happened. This is what he's pieced together. Because Zossimov says, well, what do you think happened then? And he's like, well, clearly the murderer was in the room when they were first banging on the door. Then when they went downstairs, he's like, Coke stupidly left the door and went downstairs. If he would have stayed there, none of this would have happened. The murderer would have been caught. He's like, but he got restless and impatient, went downstairs and gave the murderer a chance to get out. And when the murderer heard that people were coming up the stairs, he ran into that open flat, stood behind the door where he dropped this box of earrings. And then when they proceeded to go up to the fourth floor, he slipped away undetected, which is exactly what happened. So Razumihin is like basically stating what Raskolnikov did. And Raskolnikov is like just listening to this, like staring at the wall. And he's like, the only time he says anything was he was like behind the door. The earrings were found behind the door because he had no idea that he had dropped anything. And so this to him is like, oh my God, like another, like, oh, he slipped up. He left some evidence behind. Now people know like something that he did, even though there's no connection to him at the time. He just is like a little freaked out, like realizing that, oh my God, I dropped something I didn't even know. Like, kind of like, what more could I have done that I don't know that could lead to me? And so Zossimov and Razumihin just kind of discuss where Razumihin's like, oh, these police detectives, they're just looking at these things and they say that there's facts, but there's also motive and there's also actions. And, the actions of these painters certainly don't act like people who are murdered. He's like, these goofballs thought at first that it was the two guys that brought the porter to the door. Like, why would they have killed her and then brought the porter to the door? Like, to go look in on her, he's like, it's like he thinks they're being kind of dumb. And he's like, I like the old guy, his uncle. He's like, but, he's the old ways and we need to show them the new ways. And so it's just kind of like this, Razumihin's on a mission to prove that this painter did not do it and to find, to like point to and find the real murderer, which is, ironic. And so that's where it leaves off. And the final line is that there's some other person who has just come into the room. And we're going to find out who that is in chapter 5. So meet me there.